I'm Eleanor. For 41 years, my husband Robert and I built a life on the promise of someday. Someday when we retire, we'll travel the coast of Italy. Someday, we'll have time for long walks and lazy breakfasts. Someday, we'll finally relax and just enjoy each other. We said this passing each other in the hallway on the way to work, over quick dinners, during stolen weekends consumed by chores. Our marriage became a vessel for deferred dreams. We poured all our hopes for joy, for connection, for adventure into this distant, golden vessel called retirement. I believed in that future so completely. It was the North Star that guided us through decades of routine, through raising children and burying parents, through the quiet compromises that stack up like bricks in an ordinary life. I thought we were building towards something together. But when someday finally arrived, it wasn't golden. It was hollow. And Robert, faced with that hollow space, didn't see a partner to fill it with. He saw a mirror reflecting his own disappointment. And he blamed me for what he saw in the glass. He blamed me for the emptiness he felt inside. Then he left. Just packed a suitcase of his resentment and walked out of the life we'd spent a lifetime building. I was shattered. Not just by the loss of him, but by the annihilation of the future. Our future. That had been the cornerstone of my entire adult life. I grieved for months for the ghost of a life that never was. But then a strange thing happened. In the rubble of that imagined future, I began to find pieces of myself I'd forgotten I'd buried. And slowly, painstakingly, I started building something new. Not with a partner, but for myself. And what I built, this vibrant, messy, joyful life, was something he could have never given me, because he was always in the way of it. Robert and I met young. He was an accountant, precise, planned. I was a high school librarian, a curator of stories who had somehow let her own narrative be co-authored by someone else's spreadsheet. Our rhythms matched in a practical sense. We were good at the logistics of life. We budgeted for college funds and a retirement account with the same solemn dedication. Our dream destinations were pinned to a corkboard in the kitchen. Santorini, Kyoto, the Scottish Highlands. We'd look at them while eating leftover meatloaf on a Tuesday and feel a thrill of someday. Our conversations over the years became shorthand. The Amalfi Coast, he'd say, sighing over Bill. Yes, I'd reply, folding laundry. Someday. It was a prayer, a mantra. It made the daily grind feel sacrificial and noble. We were a good team in the trenches of life. We navigated sick kids, leaky roofs, and career frustrations with a silent, efficient solidarity. But somewhere along the way, we stopped talking about anything that wasn't practical. Romance was a scheduled date night that often got postponed. Deep conversation was a luxury for when we had more time. I thought retirement was the more time we'd been waiting for. I envisioned us finally reading the books piling up on our nightstands, taking that pottery class I'd always mentioned, getting hopelessly lost in a foreign city with no itinerary. I saw it as a beginning. For Robert, it was an ending. The day he walked out of his office for the last time, he didn't just leave his job. He left his identity, his purpose, his structure, his daily sense of importance. It all stayed behind in that empty desk. He came home to silence and to me, a woman who represented not adventure, but the end of the road. The first few weeks of retirement were awkward. We tiptoed around each other in a house that suddenly felt too quiet. The routines that had kept us orbiting each other were gone. What should we do today? I'd ask, trying to sound breezy over coffee. He'd stare out the window. I don't know. What is there to do? I'd suggest things from our someday list. We could finally plan that trip to Portugal. Look at rentals. He'd grunt. Seems like a lot of hassle. And expensive. Now that we're on a fixed income. The goalposts moved. The dreams he'd once voiced now seemed frivolous, burdensome. His boredom curdled into resentment, And that resentment had a target. Me. I became the physical manifestation of his dissatisfaction. My cheerful attempts to make plans were nagging. My contentment reading in the garden was laziness. My suggestion to visit the grandchildren was clingy. "You're just sitting there," he'd say, pacing the living room like a caged animal. "I'm reading. I'm enjoying the quiet," I'd reply. "This is what we worked for." "This nothing," he'd spit out. "You're happy with this nothings." The arguments were circular, devastating. They weren't about dishes or money. They were about the fundamental disappointment of his life, and he was holding me accountable for it. I was the architect of this empty prison in his eyes. The final break wasn't a dramatic fight. It was a quiet, chilling realization. We were at dinner. I was talking about a memoir I'd loved. He wasn't listening. He was just looking at me with a kind of detached contempt, as if I were a stranger who had tricked him into a very long, dull conversation. He said, "I don't know who you are anymore. And I don't think I want to," I said. "I think the person you don't know is yourself, Robert." A week later, he packed a bag. "I need space. I need to figure out what I want." He moved into a short-term rental apartment. The space became permanent. The divorce papers arrived 6 months later, clinical and final. He'd figured out that what he wanted wasn't me. The aftermath of his leaving was a peculiar kind of grief. I wasn't just mourning Robert, the distant, angry man he'd become. I was mourning the Robert of someday. The smiling, future version of my husband who would hold my hand on a Tuscan hillside. I was mourning the shared history that now felt like a lie, and the shared future that had vanished. The house was a museum of a closed exhibit. Every room held a ghost of a plan we'd made. I'd walk past the guest room we'd said we'd turn into a painting studio. I'd see the travel guides collecting dust. For months, I moved through the motions. I felt a profound shame, as if his abandonment was a verdict on my worth. Had I been that boring? That inadequate? Friends tried to console me. "His loss," they'd say. But it felt like my loss. The loss of meaning, of purpose, of the story I'd told myself for 4 decades. I sat in the silence he hated so much. And slowly, in that terrible quiet, I began to hear a faint voice I hadn't listened to in years. My own. It asked small questions. What do you actually want to eat for dinner? Not what's easiest for two. What if you painted the living room that deep sea green you always loved, but he thought was too dark? What if you went to that little French film festival alone? At first, the questions were terrifying. Answering them felt like betrayal. But the alternative, staying frozen in the ruins, was worst. My rebirth began with tiny, defiant acts of self-defense. I painted the living room sea green. The first brush stroke felt like a revolution. The room was suddenly mine, no longer ours. It felt like a cocoon, not a tomb. I joined a book club at the local library. Not the one with the other faculty wives, but a new one with people I didn't know. I was just Eleanor, not Robert's wife. I rediscovered my voice in discussions, tentatively at first. I signed up for a solo hiking weekend with an adventure group for women over 50. I was the most inexperienced person there. I was slow. I was scared. But I made it to the summit, and the view, and the feeling of accomplishment, was entirely my own. I hadn't had to compromise, wait for someone else, or manage anyone's mood but my own. I started a tiny online business, almost as a joke. I'd always loved pressing flowers from my garden. I began making simple framed botanical art. I called it Eleanor's Garden. I sold my first piece to a woman in Colorado. The notification ping on my phone was a sound of pure, undiluted joy. It was proof I could create something of value, all by myself. Then the travel. I started small. A solo train trip to a city 3 hours away. I ate in a restaurant alone with a book. I wandered museums at my own pace, lingering where I wanted. The loneliness was sometimes acute, but it was a clean loneliness. It wasn't the lonely feeling of being with someone who makes you feel alone. This was my solitude, and I began to furnish it with curiosity instead of fear. My first big trip was to Portugal, the trip Robert had dismissed as a hassle. I went alone. I got lost in the Alfama district, ate pastéis de nata until I was silly, and struck up a conversation with a Danish widow at a cafe. We spent the next day exploring together. I felt more connection with a stranger in 24 hours than I had with Robert in years. 2 years post-abandonment, I barely recognized the woman I'd been. The woman who waited for someday was gone. In her place was a woman fiercely devoted to today. My social circle had completely transformed. It was no longer couples defined by the husband's career. It was a tapestry of fascinating individuals. Artists I'd met in workshops, fellow solo travelers, the women from my hiking group, young baristas at my favorite cafe who called me Ms. E. My life was noisy with laughter and rich with diverse perspectives. My little business, Eleanor's Garden, had a steady following. It wasn't about the money, though it was nice to have. It was about the process, the intentionality of choosing a bloom, pressing it, composing it. It was a meditation. It was my voice, speaking through petals and stems. I bought a small, quirky cottage with a wild, untamed garden. It was everything our pristine, suburban house wasn't. Full of character, slightly impractical, and utterly my own. I painted the front door yellow. And I traveled. Not just to check places off a list, but to feel alive in them. I took a writing workshop in Greece. I went on a culinary tour of Vietnam. I learned to snorkel in Belize at 68. Each journey was a conversation between the world and myself. With no interpreter, no negotiators. I was happy. Not in a placid, contented way. In a vibrant, sometimes messy, deeply engaged way. I was living a life he could never have given me, because his presence would have required editing, compromising, and dampening my spark to accommodate his gloomy. I was never one for social media, but my daughter encouraged me to share my travels and my art on Instagram. People want to see this, Mom. It's inspiring. So I did sporadically. Pictures of my yellow door, a stunning mosaic from Istanbul, my hands covered in clay at a workshop. I forgot Robert might see it. One evening, a message request popped up. It was from him. My stomach flipped, not with longing. The message was long. It spoke of regret, of seeing my photos and realizing what he'd lost. He said he'd been in therapy, that he'd been on a journey, that he was remorseful, and had never stopped loving the woman I married. He wondered if we could talk. Maybe meet for coffee. He ended with, "You look so happy." I remember that smile. I read it 3 times. I felt pity, and a profound sense of clarity. The woman he married was the one who waited patiently for someday. That woman was gone. He wasn't reaching out to the woman I am. He was reaching out to a ghost he saw in my photos. A ghost he now realized had value. I didn't respond immediately. I slept on it. I walked in my wild garden. I thought about what closure meaning. The next day I wrote back. It was kind, but it was a closed door. "Robert, thank you for your message. I'm glad to hear you're doing the work in therapy. That's important. I am indeed happy. I've built a life that feels authentic and full. I wish you genuine peace and fulfillment on your own path. But my path is one I walk alone now. I hope you understand. Please take care." I hit send. There was no anger, no vengeance. Just a calm, definitive truth. Happiness doesn't require revenge. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply living so fully and authentically that the past loses its power to haunt you. My lack of interest was my freedom, spoken softly. If you are watching this, facing your own hollow someday, whether through abandonment, loss, or the simple, crushing weight of a dream deferred. Please hear me. Your value was never in the shared dream. It is in the dreamer. And that dreamer is still there, even if she's buried under years of compromise and quiet yearnings. Start small. What is one tiny thing you used to love that you set aside? A flavor, a color, a song? Reclaim it. It is a seams. The life you build for yourself by yourself will be more authentic than any life you could ever build for someone else's approval or alongside someone else's disappointment. You will discover capacities for joy, resilience, and courage that you never knew you had, because they were never required before. You are not too old. It is not too late. The story isn't over. You've just finally picked up the people. Robert abandoned me after retirement. He thought he was leaving behind emptiness. What he actually did was give me the greatest gift. The spacious, terrifying, beautiful opportunity to finally meet myself. And I like her very, very much. Don't be afraid of the silence after someone leaves. That's where you finally get to hear your own song. And trust me, it's a song worth singing. Your next chapter isn't a sequel. It's a brand new book. Start writing. If you want to hear more story like this, please like the video and subscribe the channel. Hit the bell icon to get notified.